So, making a video, I'm realizing it's kind of a bear to set up the system so it's recording the audio from my DAW and the music that's playing, and I can show you everything that's happening it, as well as getting my voice. And actually writing, it's on a crazy delay. It's messing with me. So we'll just work through it. And I think rather than a person instruction, I should just record it because this is really messing with me. Okay, so in this recording, we're looking at a song I made a while back with a good friend of mine. His name is Sean, Shred Sean. You can actually search him on YouTube. And he wrote a song he wanted me to put together. And in that song, we have a number of issues that need to be dealt with equalization-wise. And I realized, and I had a hunch, because I vaguely remember putting his songs together, that one of the ones had a lot of equalization work on it. So I was able to find this one. And in fact, every example that I know of using equalization is accomplished in this one song. So we can look at the various things that need to occur. Excuse me. So let's go ahead and start with the most basic thing. I'm going to pull up this guy. I'm only recording one screen, but I do have two screens. So every once in a while you'll see the mouse leave the screen, and that's where I'm going. I'm going to the other screen to grab different effects where those are all located on the other screen. So this is my first example of how to use an equalizer. So in this case, we have a very hard drop off right here for the ultra low frequencies, and then the same thing for the really high frequencies. You can see I call it master EQ. It's just kind of like a last minute equalization that you throw on your track before you produce it. I don't know 100% how important this is. I can tell you I've never heard or not heard, been able to tell a difference in a track with or without this. And so it's possibly it's just kind of like placebo effect or whatnot, but I've heard enough mixing, mastering, instructional people explain that this is a good thing to have. So typically I'll have one of these, and you can see I only have a couple different like preset ones, but this one I just about slap on every single track I make. So that's our first example. So you can see here for this type of equalizer, if I want to turn on something, right? So there I just turned on 6, I double click it, and then I can change over here. So I right clicked it on that, and I can tell if it's a peak, a low shelf, a high pass, a low pass, right? So I can change kind of like the structure of what it's doing. And then after that, you have a couple things to mess with. So you have the frequency that it's located at that's doing it. And then Q is kind of like how steep it is or is not doing that. In this case, we don't want to use this. So we're going to turn that off. And our EQ is back to the way it was. All right. So that's our first example of equalizer. Let's take a look just so we can see what's going on here. In this case, this guy's helping me make that back end steeper. So if I turn it off, looks like that, right? So I got a really, really steep Q on this. That'd be a high pass for that number 2. So in order to kind of balance that out, because you can see it's actually spiking some of the things because it's so steep, we turn on this guy as well to bring that spike down. So let's take a look at the number 2 guy. So you can see the Q is kind of high, the frequency is really low, and so I'm trying to have a really steep line there. If you're a little less aggressive about it, I can take this number 2 and just remove the 2, and you can see now if I make this flat, my roll off starts much higher, much higher, right? Because the difference between 30 and 60 hertz that's like a bunch of bass notes. You easily play with like a regular, not even an altered tune bass guitar, like just a standard 4-string one you buy at a store. You're already playing down in the 40s for your low notes. And then if you play any of the types of music that I end up playing with my 5-string guitars, you're easily down in the 30s. So you need those frequencies. So that's kind of why I increase the Q, get it really sharp looking, and then let's get this looking like it used to, right about like that. See, so you can see now at 30 hertz we're getting the roll off instead of 60, and it's a really steep roll off for what it is. So that's what we're doing here. And then once again, now let's go ahead and take a look at the highs. So it's a low pass filter, and then the Q is actually preset. I didn't mess with that Q, I can tell you that right now. But I do just take this and I grab it and I bring it up to 20. So anything over 20 should just cut off. Here we go. So that's the example of that type of equalization. Kind of the cool thing about this is you literally you take the time to make this in your program once, you save it, and you'll never need to rebuild it ever again, right? It's set. And you can just, next time you make a song, you pull up the preset, boom, you're good to go. So from the industry, it seems like everyone has these to make sure that there's no frequencies above or below those 20 hertz to anything lower than that, and then nothing higher than 20,000 hertz. All right, let's look at our next example of equalization. What we're gonna do is we're gonna go to the bass track. So I was doing something weird with these tracks, and we'll look at the active EQ later. That'll be the very final example because that one's relatively complex. But we're going to look at this. So in this case, you can see I have two different bass guitar tracks. I'll pull up the other one in just a second. Here it is. Is that correct? I think I pulled up the wrong one. There we go. That's the one. Okay, so these are two different bass guitar track equalizers. So you can see over here track 20 and track 21. So on the first track, I'm only interested in kind of the low sounds, and I have a couple things working to do that. This thing is a special plugin that is both a compressor and an equalizer at the same time, and it just makes the deep notes of the bass sound like really strong and thick, which is what we want. And so with the equalizer, I'm helping support that by not allowing anything else to go through. And what this allows me to do then is dial in the volume of the deep sounds individually from the volume of the high sounds, which that's going to come from this guy over here. So in this case, the 6 should just be a low pass, and it's set at 1,000 hertz. And the Q, right, once again, that's the sharpness of what it's doing. So there we go with that. The gain is going to set where that shelf kind of clamps down on it. Now let's say you want a subtle effect. You could just bring the gain down to like 6. That's going to be a more subtle effect. Or like 3. Sometimes my adjustments are going to be very, very small to get the effect that I want. Sometimes it's just 1 decibel or something. So you don't necessarily always need to slam it down. But in this case, because I want the high frequencies to come out from a different track, I'm just killing them. And so I'm bringing that volume down as low as I possibly can. Alrighty. So that's the deep sounds for the bass. And let's go ahead and just listen to that for a second so we can hear what it sounds like. So I'll pull back up that equalizer so we can see it as it's moving around. So the cool thing about this one is it has a visualizer, so you can actually see what's occurring with the sound. And so look at that huge low in there, all those deep notes down below. Excuse me. So when you're looking at the equalizer and you're trying to understand what's going on when it has those visualizers, you can see you'll have like a fundamental, and so that's the most basic aspect of the note, right? So if you're, it's like, it would be the name of the note. So if you play an A on the piano, right, the fundamental is going to be that frequency of A. But all the other frequencies above it, I'll play that again so you can see that there's more things going on above the fundamental. See, but we have all these other sounds up here. You see that? And you can also see that this thing's rolling them off pretty aggressively. You can see that there's not anything happening up here. I can guarantee the bass is making frequencies up in that, but it's clamping it down and getting rid of all of them. So when your fundamental shouldn't really sound too different compared to other instruments. The fundamentals mostly just a characteristic of the note. So those higher frequencies that are coming out are everything that makes that instrument sound like that instrument, right? Why does a saxophone sound like a saxophone? It's because of the higher frequencies. Why does a bass guitar sound like a bass guitar? Or a piano sound like a piano? It's those higher frequencies that come in. If we get rid of everything but the fundamental, we're left with a sine wave. And that might be something you've already been shown in your studies. But basically a sine wave, it's only a single frequency and it sounds very soft and round. And typically that's what people use as their basis for subwoofer type frequencies or songs. Let's say it's I don't know, like a dance or a pop song, like those. The low end is almost exclusively sine waves, and so it has a very distinct sound. It doesn't sound real because nothing sounds like that, but that's what's happening there. Sine wave is literally just the fundamental. So if we were to boil our instruments, piano, guitar, whatever, down to just the fundamental, it's just going to sound like a sine wave. It's not going to sound like an instrument anymore. So that's why we keep things other than the fundamental in there. That's what gives it the characteristic. So next up, let's go ahead and take a look at the high part of the track. Okay, let's take a look. And so in this case, what I'm doing then is I start off with a high pass filter. So you can see I set that somewhat aggressive, slope, right? Low frequency. And when I'm dialing the low frequency in, I'm literally just listening to the track and adjusting this as I'm listening to it to get it to the point where it retains just the characteristics I want it to retain. So in this case, this is going to be like the actual tone. This is where we hear the bass in the mix. We're not going to really know what the bass guitar sounds like from the low end. The low end is just about generating power and kind of that thump in the listener's chest or ears. It's not about understanding like what that bass actually sounds like. So then we can later come in and dial this in just enough so, you know, as I'm doing a mix, and if it's a difficult mix such as this one, right, I can separate those two things. So different instruments, especially if it's something like a bass guitar or something, or maybe a piano would be an excellent example as well. So if you think about it, you have a really wide range of frequencies, and those you might get them dialed in to sound mixed in well with the music in the low frequencies, but then your high frequencies, maybe it's not loud enough, maybe it's too loud, things like that. And you can split your job up into multiple pieces by having identical tracks, because if you look down here, they are identical tracks between each other right here. They're absolutely identical. The only difference is one, I'm only letting the low frequencies in, and the other one, I'm trying to bring out kind of like the tonal characteristic of the bass. So then, this was an afterthought, was to bring this 4-channel up. Oops. Let's get back over here. The 4th channel, I needed more characteristic coming out of this thing. So what I did was I boosted it right around the 1K, and that's a really steep Q. Again, you can see there. In this case, this is a peak, so that's a different type of thing. So far, we've only been using low passes, high passes, or shelves, right? But now we're using a peak, and I maxed that out. And then later on, or I shouldn't say later on, because I actually did this earlier than I did boosting the 4, was this channel 6 right here. And over here, the frequencies that I start cutting down really hard on is actually at just 3000 hertz, which is relatively low for things. But in this particular case, I wanted the bass to stay out of the guitars as much as possible. And so we can get, and also it's a little bit based off of like your personal preference and choice, but I was noticing that the tones that were coming out of the bass guitar, I thought sounded the best around that 1K region. So things far above 1K, I didn't think sounded good, so I got rid of them. Things far below 1K, I didn't think sounded, well, actually I just wanted them to get out of the way, right? Because I already had them in another track. So then you're left with kind of this peak and trough kind of thing, a little mountain going on that's focusing this particular sound on that 1K area. And then later on, let's see what's a good way to show it. I'll show it like this. So you can see the deep bass is a lot louder than this. And so I set up the mix, and I get that deep bass to where I think it sounds good, and then I just roll this up, bring it in until I start to hear it in the song, and then I stop and just leave it right there. So now we've looked at kind of our high pass, low pass master track. Then in the bass guitar, we've looked at high pass and low pass in the context of trying to eliminate certain frequencies from a bass guitar that we don't want. And then we've also now looked at a special technique that you can employ of having two identical tracks and setting them up to have individual equalization goals for each track that then you're blending in as needed for the mix, which just really in the end, if you think about it, it could have been accomplished from a single track with a single equalizer, but the task becomes much more complicated because not only are you sitting there trying to blend in that track into the whole project at a good thing, but then you're having to go back into the equalizer and readjust that equalizer because, right, so you're taking a complicated task and you're simplifying it by separating them into different tracks. So we've looked at that now. And then we also did look at within the higher frequency track for the bass, we looked at how to make a peak, right? Now, our final example is going to be Sean's guitar work, which is very, very, very technically proficient. He's extremely good at what he does. So we'll take a look at this guy right here. Let's go ahead and take a listen. So Sean makes some really, really good sounding guitar lines, and later on in the song, he goes totally ballistic, shredding, which is awesome. So in this case, we can see I've done a number of things to this track, and they're accomplishing kind of different goals, but working to make this single track sound a little better and bring out the parts of it that I want the listener to hear, and then trying to remove certain parts that I don't want the listener to hear. Now, this is a good example of something I learned maybe a few years after I started equalizing things, is that start your equalization by subtracting. So if you subtract sounds, right? So if you look at this equalizer right here, nothing is higher than 0 dB. Nothing is higher than that, right? That the loudest point of the track is 0. And everything else is subtracted around it. If you think about it, I could take like the 3, 5, the 2 bands, and those could have been my 0, and I could have been trying to boost things with that 4 band or something like that, right? So instead of that, because equalizers are always going to introduce minute bits of artifacting and distortion. So you think about it, you're processing music. And technically speaking, the less we have to equalize something, the better. So I will work pretty hard when I'm doing my initial recordings, when I record myself, my own playing at home, to try to get things dialed in via the instrument or my voice or whatever it is. Try to get those sounds dialed in off the get-go. Because equalizing later on, number one, is harder, more time consuming. And number two, you're introducing more data points, and you're kind of taking away from like the information of the waveform, right? And that's always going to degrade the quality of your audio. You're hoping that degradation nobody can hear that there's a problem. Now, subtracting doesn't really cause any big issues. Addition. So if you saw on the bass track, when I boosted that four band all the way up to 24 decibels, and it was way up there, if I were to turn that track really loud, it's going to distort in my song. And the distortion is coming from loss of audio quality, right? So in this case, I haven't done that here. I'm not boosting anything. I don't need to. So we're just subtracting things. So we'll go ahead and take a look at this first band right here. Number one, in this band, we are doing a low pass or high pass filter, and we are trying to just subtract out any kind of deep sounds off of his guitar track that might be in there. And I think I did that because I noticed a couple notes in there that did have kind of deep sounds that we wanted to get rid of, right? That's where the bass guitar is. That's where the kick drums are. That's where the toms are for the drum set and things like that. That's where we want those tones. We don't want an accidental guitar note kind of taking up those frequencies in the mix. Now, here's a cool technique, is this high area. So we can see the 6 right here, the 6 band is a high shelf, and we're dropping that down. And so it's kind of like a low pass filter, but not slammed all the way down to negative 24 decibels. And we're just kind of dropping down those highs a little bit, right? And the reason why I was doing that was because in the mixing, like when you turn up the song really loud, the guitar tone actually was really shrill and it was hurting my ears. Now I noticed this wasn't enough to eliminate the issue. So then what we do is we kind of do this notch filtering. That's kind of, I guess, the technical term. So let's go ahead and take a look at this 3. So here's what we do when we want to find a shrill sound or some kind of sound we don't want to hear, is we actually do the reverse. We boost it, and then we pan through until we find the sound that is offending our ears. It'll get really loud, and we're like, oop, that's it. And at that point, you take it and you tell it, I want you to, we can watch it go down. I want you to go away. And we get rid of that sound. So in this case, I'm doing little notch filters on a couple places that his track was hurting my ears. Now, I don't remember where that was, but I'm not going to save things. So it'll go back to where it used to be. But that's how we do a notch filter. Let's see if we can actually test this out ourselves right now. So that was kind of cool. You could actually hear when I got it right on the right spot, we got this weird sound like coming out of that track, right? So we can just eliminate it if we want to. I was doing a more subtle thing where I was only going down a couple decibels. And I think maybe the reason for that was when I went 100% of the way down, the track started kind of sounding a little more muffled. Right, we don't want to completely get rid of the high end on a guitar solo because the high end is very characteristic tone. So we don't want to completely kill it, but we want to keep it under the threshold of hurting our listeners' ears, obviously. So now we've looked at notch filtering, right? And so in order to do this, just to reiterate, you push the notch all the way up to plus 24 decibels, and you just slowly move it through your track until you hear the offending sound. And typically, you're not going to be just like, I'm just going to go searching for weird sounds in my audio track. Don't do that, because you'll sit there all day long with like 3 trillion notch filters in there. You only want to be searching with a notch filter when you hear something offending, something that's hurting your ears, and you're like, I need to go find that. Usually you should have some kind of inkling of, I think the problem sound is somewhere between, 300 and 1000 hertz. Or I think the problem is somewhere between 2K and 5K or something like that. You should have some kind of inkling of where that bad sound is. If you're going out and searching through your track, you're going to make little issues obvious, that didn't need to be erased. And you're going to have a million notch filters, and it's not going to help the tone of the track. So you only want to be searching for problem sounds that you can hear right off the get-go without any equalization. If you can hear that there's problems, you can hear that there's things that are going to be hurting the listener's ears, then you go in. And that kind of also then goes back to what I was saying earlier of equalization is something we don't want to have to do, right? If the initial recording, always work to make the initial recording better and then equalize when you have to, right? Equalization is not a fix, and it kind of introduces our audio artifacts into our sound. So the less we do it, the better. That's kind of the attitude you want to have with equalization. And I think when I was young, I was guilty of equalizing the crap out of everything. And nowadays, the goal is to equalize as little as possible. So, okay, so there we go. So there's one final type of equalization. I imagine you're not going to learn this in your studies from a school or whatnot, but this one is pretty dang cool. So we're going to go over here, and it's active EQ. Let's take a look at this. So what does the word active mean? It means that there's currently processing occurring. And it means that the equalizer is changing due to certain inputs. So let's take a look at what happens for this song. Let's go ahead and just listen to the whole song for a second. So what's happening with this thing? What are we doing? Why is it there? So this is a technique that I want to say started with like EDM and dance music and things like that. So when you have a kick, it's a really low frequency and there's not a particular note that kick drum is quote unquote played at, right? If you think about it, it's kind of just like a low end sound, and there will be frequencies in that sound, but they're not aiming for one particular note or another. Now your bass, your sub sound, your low notes on your piano, things like that, those do have frequencies, right? And if the moments that the kick is going off are blended with the moments that the low frequencies instruments, bass guitar, piano, things like that, if the kick is blended with that, sometimes there can be some bad sounds that go on. On top of that, right, so we're not going to want those sounds to be super loud while the kick is going off. And then now, moving on to my next point I was going to make, is on top of that, we can give the illusion of the kick drum hitting the listener's ears harder and being more prominent by having, for a fraction of a second, those lower frequency instruments to actually drop out for a fraction of a second. And so the kick hits you harder. You feel like the kick is even louder than it actually is because all those deep frequencies are cutting out. It's kind of like an auditory illusion. So we're taking advantage of kind of something that EDM and dance music pioneered, I guess, to help make our, in this case, it's kind of, I don't know, like a fusion-y type rock-ish song. And we're making it sound a little better, kind of using their techniques. So in this case, we take this function, this HP right here, and we link it to the kick drum. Let's see. How can I show this? I think so. There's the kick. Okay. Oh, there it was. Okay, so we're going to bring this over here. So in this case, this is track 14, and it's only the kick sound. I'm not sending it to the master. That means nobody can hear this in the track. They can't hear this, but it's still calculating those sounds. Those sounds are getting sent to track 19, where the piano is, track 20, where the bass is, track 21, where the bass is again, because I have multiple bass tracks. And it's communicating that there's sound happening whenever the kick goes off. That kick is then reconnected to this equalizer for this low frequency notch that happens around 200 hertz and then down to basically down to nothing. And so as the song plays, anytime the kick drum happens, it's going to activate that part of the equalizer and drop it down. And that's going to help make the kick drum in the drum track sound louder. So those are all the different ways that I use Equalizer. Probably the first 4 or 5 ways that I was explaining will be things that you'll be responsible for learning in your education. And that very last one is a cool extra one to learn about. It does take a little bit of like finessing, figuring out like, okay, how do I connect the sound from one track to the equalizer in another track? It takes a little bit to understand it and kind of link everything up. But it's more of like, the concept is really simple. What's difficult about it is more of like getting the software to do it. It's more of a programming type thing, I guess. It's not really about, it's like a difficult concept to understand or anything like that. It's very easy to understand. So hopefully that all works. If I'm able to share this with you in person, I'll do that. But I want to make this video because I was realizing setting up the recording for this was really difficult. So I figured I might as well get the recording done. And if it ends up being too hard to do this in person, then we can always lean on I can just send you the recording instead. Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully that helps you out.